friends, Laurelei Black here from Blade Broom, and thanks for joining me again this week. We are going to talk about pendulums and dowsing and divination and magic with pendulums specifically. As part of that, we're going to talk about the history of pendulums and dowsing rods. Even though they're different tools, they've both been used for that dowsing aspect of a big part of what pendulums have been known for and used for throughout history. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and then get into how pendulums themselves are used as a dowsing tool, a divination tool, and a tool for magic. So let's get started. So a little bit about the history of dowsing. It's actually one of our most anciently known divination forms and mystical or magical tools, spiritual tools that we as humans have used. We have records dating back to about 6000 BC in the form of cave art. So this picture that I'm showing you right now is from a cave in southern Algiers, and it's a little hard to make out, but there is actually a Y rod, not dissimilar to the types of Y rods that are still being used in dowsing today. Dowsing being referred to definitely with rods, but possibly also with pendulums. And then moving forward, we have evidence in ancient China, ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, all of those places about dowsing rods for sure being used, and very often those Y rods being used to find resources, to find people, but very, very often to find things like precious minerals and water, which was a very precious resource. Always has been a precious resource. It's where we establish towns and villages. It's one of the first things that we need in order to be able to establish settlements and create life. So being able to find fresh water is an important skill and something that has often been attributed as a magical skill, and the use of Y rods as a divining tool is a big part of that practice. So we see that throughout ancient history. Very anciently, it's a little more difficult to tell whether or not pendulums were actually being used. And I actually have several pendulums here with me today, and I'll show you pictures of them. That it's a little bit more difficult to know whether something with sort of a chain or a string and a plum on the end, a heavy weight or a heavier weight, that could swing freely. If something like this that we know and use as a pendulum, if this was being used very anciently, a lot of times they just referred to it as dowsing, and they didn't specify what kind of tool was being used. We do see in 1271 AD, Marco Polo specifically referencing pendulums, dowsing rods, and the compass, all as methods of being able to find a path, of being able to find resources, and then of also being able to find people. And he says that he uses these tools frequently and that he learned them while he was in China. And so we know that from those ancient roots, people in China were using pendulums, dowsing rods, and the compass. So then if we fast forward another 500 years, we see that in France, there's specific mention of pendulums being used in order to find and trace criminals and thieves, specifically, to be able to find lost objects, stolen objects, and the people who stole those objects. So that's actually really notable that it was used sort of in their criminal justice system at the time. And then part of what's notable to me about that is that not too long before 1701, being a diviner, being a dowser, was specifically used as an accusation against people who were suspected of witchcraft. And if there was evidence that you were a diviner or a dowser, things like a Y rod in your home, or a pendulum, then that was enough evidence to convict you of witchcraft. Which is a tricky thing, right? Because just a necklace that you wear can be so infused with your energy that you take it off and use it as a pendulum. In fact, that's one of the more common worldwide practices, one of the first methods of divination that I was actually introduced to. So in fact, that was considered a perfectly acceptable and not witchcraft at all method of divination. Growing up in the church, I went to a Baptist, Southern Baptist, Missionary Baptist church from a very young age. In fact, I went to Baptist school until I was in the 6th grade. And, it was the daughter of a missionary that taught me that you could take off your cross necklace and use it to ask questions, yes, no questions about love divinations, about whether or not you were going to get married to a certain young man, or, if you were pregnant, you could dangle it over your belly and see what kind of, what the gender of your child was going to be. So, the impulse to use a pendulum is nigh on universal. I'm not going to say that it's in absolutely every culture, but it has certainly fed down through the Chinese culture, through Egyptian, Roman, Greek, and all the cultures that those ancient civilizations have influenced, which is a lot of world cultures, have been touched by pendulum use. So it's definitely there and highly embedded. And part of the reason for that is because it's such a simple tool to use. Again, it really just takes something that swings freely. So something like a necklace or a bracelet that has a pendant on it, or a heavy charm that can hang freely without dropping off or getting lost, is all that you really require. You don't have to make something, really special. In fact, something that you're wearing close to your body a lot, I think, is a really effective pendulum. This necklace and set of charms right here is one of my very favorite pendulums. When we're talking about dowsing rods, though, and I do want to just briefly explain a little bit about dowsing rods, because it's probably not something that I'll do a whole episode on, although I think it's fascinating and I think it's worth looking into, and I have used them a little bit. There are a couple of different styles of dowsing rods. One of them is a Y-shaped branch, and the method that I'm familiar with using it, you hold on to the Y ends with both hands, and then the tip points down, like it dips down when it's drawn to the thing that you're looking for. So you'd sort of walk through a field or an area and note where it nods. It's said that there are certain people who are really gifted at doing this, and they're typically called water witchers, for instance. So, and this is something that's still used by people currently. The water companies very often employ people who are good at finding water with divining rods. So whether they're using that Y-tipped one, or there's another system that uses 2 rods that are sort of L-shaped, and you hold them each in your hands, and they're usually in some kind of sleeve so that they can swing freely. So if you imagine, in fact, you can make a set of your own like these really simply and really cheaply by just taking 2 coat hangers and sort of using wire snips to cut them apart and bend them into an L shape where there's a short end and then a long end. that protrudes out from you, and then sticking them into a pair of straws so that they can swing around. And if you sit with them for just a second, what you notice is that at first your thoughts and your energy are really scattered, and they just kind of, they're like a bug's antennae, and they just sort of like go everywhere. They don't go up and down. They're not able to do that. But they go, you know, sort of back and forth, and they crisscross each other, and they might kind of go in the same direction for a little bit. But then if you focus your attention on something, like a person in the room, they'll zero in on that person. Like they'll both just go over to that person. Or if you think about an object that's on the other side of the room, they'll swing over to that object. And then if you think about something that you really like, they'll open up. And if you think about something that you really dislike or that's a really negative association for you, they'll close. So typically the way that you would use this if you wanted to use it as a divination method is that open is yes and closed is no. Yeah, it's just fascinating the way that it works. So, and it's one of those ways that you can kind of prove to yourself that energy moves, and that your thoughts can control physical objects in the area. It's really cool. In terms of how pendulums and divining rods work, dowsing tools, in terms of how these things work, there are sort of two schools of thought on it. Either that it's energy that's moving through your body and into the tool, and that it's tapping into sort of your nervous system and what you know, even though what you know may be so subconscious that you would really struggle to ever pull it out consciously. So that what you know may be things that you're picking up, like that you can smell the water under the surface of the earth, that you can smell whatever it is, or that you can see signs in the area that would indicate to you, if you were able to recognize them consciously, there's water here. But we haven't really been trained to know what that is, right? So in our conscious daily waking state, we are not tapped into that. But our instinctual selves get it. And some of us get it better than others. So we're able to use that tool, and I'm holding a divining rod here in my hands. We're able to use that tool, whether it's the Y rod or the L rods or a pendulum. We're able to use that to be able to tell ourselves something we already know, whether that's something that's in the physical world, or whether it's information that we need to tell ourselves, like, that person's bad for you, don't date them. Or this job would be great for you, you should absolutely pursue it. The kinds of things that we ask in divination. And you can get down to really specific things. Usually with a divination system like this, you're asking yes, no questions. So that energy method is one school of thought on how it works. Another school of thought on how it works is that it is more spirit driven, and that it is either a familiar spirit that works with you, that is guiding those rods, pointing them for you in the direction of the thing that you want or need to know, or guiding the pendulum so that it is answering questions for you in a way that best assists you, or still spirit driven, but that it is a spirit within the tool itself. So that's a more animistic view that says that there is an indwelling spirit within each thing, so that the spirit of each pendulum that you might own would be a different spirit and not the same familiar spirit guiding each pendulum, if that makes sense. So I'm not necessarily going to tell you which one that you ought to believe. I'm just going to tell you that I absolutely use pendulums a whole lot, and I have a lot of, I don't even know that I would call it faith at this point, faith that they work. I have a lot of proof that they work. In my experience, pendulum is one of the easiest and most reliable methods of divination that I've used in my years as a witch. So I highly recommend it as a way to get started with divination if you haven't used divination before. And even if you have used divination before, I think that it's a great way to get sort of in touch with some things that you might have overlooked with pendulum use. So then the question is, how do you use a pendulum? We've sort of talked about how they work or how they might work, some theories around how they might work. How do you actually use one? And really that depends on what you're using it for. So you could be using it for dowsing, the same way that the dowsing rods are used. And I've kind of already talked about how you would use a dowsing rod. So with the Y rods, you know, you're waiting for it to tip down to show you where you need to be going. With the Y rods, you're relying on that open and closed, you know, that it's going to be, or the pointing, like go over there, and go straight, and then sort of that opening or closing, like you know, hot and cold, as far as following that track. With the pendulum, you can do it really one of two ways. From my experience, there might be other ways to do it, but these are the ways that I was taught, and these are the ways that I have employed it. So feel free to research and let me know if you use something different. Write to me down in the comments. I would love to know what other ways people are using and what has worked for you. These are the ways that have worked for me. So one of the ways is to just sort of like draw out a map on just a sheet of paper of the area that you suspect the thing is in. So I use pendulums a lot with lost objects. I find them to be very useful with lost things. They also have a great reputation with stolen things, but it's that idea of something that's missing. So, but they can also be used for people, and it's that same idea, somebody that is sort of hiding or hidden in some way that you're not finding. So whether it's a map of a room, you know, you've lost the keys, you've lost the remote control, you've lost the flash drive, you've lost, you know, whatever the thing is, the little thing that's hiding, and you don't know exactly where it is. Or whether it's a map of your entire living space, you know, your domicile. Or it could be a map of your neighborhood or of your city that you live in, because maybe you're looking for something that could have gotten misplaced on a wider scale. So you can do that and then use the pendulum and gauge by the way it swings for you where specifically you should focus your search. So that's one of the things. Now I'm going to tell you that it's not going to work exactly like it does for the Three Sisters on Charmed. Like it's not going to glue itself to the page. But it won't be terribly unlike that in the sense that you'll have, it'll kind of be a little bit lackluster when it's not, when you're not in a right area. Maybe you won't get very much of a swing, or maybe it'll be erratic in some way. And then when you narrow in on it, it might be these little tight, you know, like very wound up circles, or it might be, typically I find for me the way my pendulum speaks to me, and your pendulum might speak to you differently, so that's something to know. When I get really wide swings, when I'm actually dowsing for something, that means that I'm in the right general area, maybe, but it's too broad still. I need to narrow it down to something more specific. So another way that you could do it is to take it out into the field, meaning out into the space, not into like an actual meadow, unless that's where you lost the thing. But take it out into the practical space where you need to be looking, and then let it swing for you. And you could either be looking for the way your pendulum speaks to you in yeses and nos, or just dealing with circles, circular swings. That really, again, has to do with the way your pendulum speaks to you. Which brings us to the next method of using your pendulum for divination. And again, I will say that there are two basic methods. One is very simple and one is more complex. So in the simple method, you're just going to be asking a series of yes or no questions and letting the pendulum show you yes or no answers, or kind of waffling in whatever way your pendulum waffles for you, with sort of these like, maybe, I don't know, ask a different question sort of answers. And that language of your pendulum is really going to vary for you than it does for me. It might not vary greatly. There are only so many ways that a pendulum is going to swing, but from one practitioner to the next, there are sort of different ways of interpreting pendulum swings. So one of the things that I always do at the beginning of every single reading, even though after 25 years, I kind of know how a pendulum's going to answer me, but at the very beginning of every single reading, and it's become a bit of a ritual for me, I always say, show me yes. And my pendulum swings in a straight line for yes, every time, every time. And then I'll say, I'll let it come back to still, and I'll say, show me no. And mine does a circle for no, like the O and no. And then I'll say something like, can I ask you questions about teaching others about pendulum readings today? Yes. My pendulum's very agreeable to this episode. Thank you. And I always say thank you, because I work in a very inspirited model of magic. I've mentioned that before on the channel, but I work in a very animistic model. So for me, every single one of my pendulums, and I have a few that I work with, I very much see them as each having their own spirit attached to them. So I give them offerings and I offer them thanks, and I ask their permission before working with them. That's my method. But it may be different for you. That may not appeal to your sense of art, and these magical arts are individual and unique in that way. So I'm not going to tell you what's right and wrong as far as that goes. I'm just going to tell you what works for me and offer them for your use. If I've phrased a question very poorly, or the answer is very unclear, or there are a lot of factors that are going on where maybe the outcome isn't decided yet, and the pendulum just can't give a very good answer yet, I have found that I get, if you can see that like my pendulum's just barely moving right now, I'll get answers like this, where like not only is it sort of a weak answer, but it's a little difficult to even tell, like, is this a yes? Is this a no? It's kind of going back and forth between straight lines and circles. Maybe it's kind of an oblong. Like right now I'm not even asking a question, but I'm directing my attention to the pendulum. So it's like, what do you want from me? I don't even know. And thank you, pendulum. And so you may find that you have similar experiences like that, and you'll get to know your yeses and nos and maybes and ask a different question and that kind of thing from your pendulum. You'll develop that relationship and that sort of instinctive interpretation from that simple method. And then there's the more complex method, where you can actually have a mat or a cloth or a chart that you've designed or purchased. There are several that are available for purchase online. You can actually buy, there's a book, and again, I'll link this book below if you're interested in that. That's just like a spiral bound book that has probably 30 or 40 different charts in it. And they're all in a half circle. But you can also make something like this for yourself, either something that's disposable, that's just a one-time use, or something more permanent that you use on a regular basis. Very often they're in a semicircle so that because if a pendulum's swinging in a straight line, to be able to select a letter, if it's in a circle, you might not know if it's pointing at the letter over here or the letter over here, right? So the semicircle can be helpful that way. Or you might put letters on top but numbers on the bottom. Because you know if you're asking it for a name, it's probably not going to have numbers in it. But these kinds of charts often involve things like letters, numbers. They might have a yes and no, and for some people, yes is like back and forth, and then no is side to side, so it's like nodding and shaking the head. So that might be on the board as well. And then maybe might be in a circle. So I've seen that set up a lot in pendulum mats or pendulum boards. There might be common phrases like hello, goodbye, the same way that you'd find on a talking board. So that if you're feeling sort of the energy of the pendulum drawing you to an area the way you would with dowsing, you know that it's time for that session to be over. For instance, if it was drawing itself to goodbye. I've seen zodiacal signs and planetary signs and symbols on boards and mats, but then I've also seen some boards and mats, like the one I'm linking below, that has like wildly specific charts, you know, things like body systems and food allergies and things that you might study in school and career pathways and that type of thing, because really you can use a pendulum for anything. Now I find for those types of things that those are maybe one-time use unless I'm reading for somebody else, like when I was reading professionally in a shop, then I might use that chart over and over again. If I'm reading for myself and a closer group of friends and family, though, I don't really need to have as many charts and things as I found in a book like that. I often find that just being able to drill down on the questions that are the most relevant to that particular reading are the most useful for me. But your mileage may vary, so use it if you find it useful. And otherwise develop something that you do find useful for yourself. And the last way that you might be interested in learning about how to use a pendulum is for magic itself. Now, again, there might be as many ways to use a pendulum for magic as there are magical practitioners, but I have found that since a pendulum is so sort of inherently linked to finding lost objects and people, that I use pendulums in magic that is for that same purpose. So one of my favorite spells involving a pendulum is if I have lost something, and I've used this spell so many times because evidently I misplace things a lot. But if I'm missing something and I'm at a loss, I've looked in all the usual places for it and I just can't find it. I've even looked in some unusual places. I will dress a candle, and depending on how lost I think the thing is, it might just be a chime candle, you know, one of the little skinny ones that are only about yay big, or it might be a big like vigil candle. But I'll dress and empower a candle, and if it's a chime candle, I'll carve it. You know, if it's something where the wax is exposed, I'll carve it and do all those things with it. And if it's a big vigil candle, I might write on the sides with a Sharpie because it takes really well to that. And all of those types of things. But either way, I'm dressing it with the herbs and the oils and the whole 9 yards. And then I'll take my pendulum and I'll swing it around the candle clockwise while I say, by the power of 3 times 3, what once was lost returned to me. By land and fire and sky and sea, what once was lost returned to me. And I'll say that whole thing 3 times. And then I'll lay the pendulum in a circle around the base of the candle. And usually, by the time the candle is burned all the way down, whatever the thing is, I will have remembered where it is, or I'll have this big, aha, I should go look over here, even though that is a ridiculous place for that object to be. Or somebody will have brought it to me. Hey, I found this. And they won't even know I was looking for it. I've had all of those things happen. Almost always before the candle is burned all the way out. One time, interestingly, I had the pendulum disappear for a while. Like the thing was so hard lost that the pendulum disappeared off my altar where I had been working with it, and I couldn't find the pendulum either. And then both the pendulum and the lost item turned up in separate places. They weren't in the same place, but they both turned up simultaneously, like same day. And they didn't turn up with me looking for them. They turned up, both of them, with people handing them to me. One of them was in a place I had looked, I'm not even kidding, 3 times. And the other one was in a place that there's just no way that I would have ever thought to look there because it wasn't a place that I was prone to go. So, this one works. I would be very curious to know how you're using pendulums in your magic as well, so drop some comments below. I would be very interested in engaging with you on that. That's all I've got for you guys today on pendulums. I could probably go on. You can tell I'm pretty jazzed up about them, but I won't. I feel like that was enough. Like, subscribe, share, comment, do all those things. Remember that I have just started writing for OOAK publication. That link is down below as well in my link tree. And I've got some BOS pages and other things for you to check out down there too. So feel free to peruse the links below. And I will see you guys back here next Monday at noon for some more great witchiness. Bye, friends.